Today we're going to take a look at the British Empire in 1763 and focus especially on the American colonies, His Majesty's colonies in North America. Right at 1763, we're going to take a look at what the colonies looked like, and we're going to see how they had changed to some extent. And we're also going to take a look at the British situation, not only in the world, but also in the Americas. Now, there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning here really quickly. The first thing is that in 1761, George II died, and his grandson, George III, who the Americans would see after 1776 as the root of all their problems. George III took the throne, 1761. At the time, America was involved, and the British Empire was involved in a war that over here in America was called the French and Indian War, and in Europe was called the 7 Years' War. It had started in the middle of the 1750s and would end in 1763, with the British essentially victorious, and not only victorious, but also having the largest empire in the world. The sun would never set, as the saying goes, after the British had acquired territories from France and Spain, who lost the war. So let's take a look at the colonies in 1763. In 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, Britain signed a peace treaty with France that gave her Canada and the American West all the way to the Mississippi River. France and Spain no longer threatened the British Empire, which stretched from India to Illinois. Now, we're going to narrow down our look here, our focus, on His Majesty's 13 colonies in North America. The first thing to do is probably to take a look and see what those colonies consisted of. So let's start at the top and work our way down. The top area, of course, is called New England. It consists of Maine, which at the time was a part of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, which had become a royal colony after 1688, Massachusetts, which became a royal colony after 1692, Connecticut, a royal colony after 1662, and Rhode Island, a royal colony after 1663. Next, we come to the middle colonies. From north to south, they consist of New York, which became a royal colony in 1686, New Jersey, which was originally a proprietary colony, that is, it was owned by a group of men under a grant from the king. It had been a proprietary colony and would become a royal colony in 1702. Pennsylvania, in 1763, was still a proprietary colony under the rule of the Penn family, a Quaker family from England, who had been given the grant of land in what is now Pennsylvania by the king. Now, Pennsylvania was meant to be a refuge for Quakers. Being a Quaker in England was illegal, and so William Penn, a very important member of the British gentry, was given a charter by the King of England to found Pennsylvania, which is Latin for Penn's Woods. And it would remain a proprietary colony up to the American Revolution. Delaware was also a proprietary colony under the Penn family, the same family that owned Pennsylvania. And now we come to the southern colonies. Again, from north to south, Maryland, a proprietary colony ruled by Lord Baltimore and the family of the Lords Baltimore, and it again would stay a proprietary colony up until the American Revolution, although it had considerably more royal oversight than Pennsylvania did. South of that is Virginia. Virginia became a royal colony after 1624. From there, below that is North Carolina, which had started out as a proprietary colony and been turned into a royal colony in 1729. South Carolina was turned into a royal colony also in 1729. And finally, Georgia, established in 1732 as a philanthropic colony, a colony to which the poor of London were sent in order to rehabilitate themselves and become good English farmers. Established, as I said, in 1732 by a fellow by the name of James Oglethorpe. It became a royal colony in 1752. Now, in addition to those formal colonies from Maine to Georgia, there was another area, what we might call a national region of the American colonies. And you see it on the map to the west in blue. We usually refer to this area as the back country, the back country. It was located all the way along the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. I discussed it earlier when I talked about the geography of North America. This area was interesting because it was made up primarily of late arrivals who moved into the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains to start settlements and farms of their own. The folks who settled there were sort of different in many ways from the people who settled along the eastern seaboard and moved into the area up to the Appalachians. They would have more in common with each other from western New York all the way down to western Georgia than they did with the folks who lived on the seacoast and in the area called the Piedmont, which is the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, as we've seen in 1763, most of the British colonies in North America were royal colonies. That is, they were colonies that belonged in a political sense to the British crown, to the king. Each royal colony had a charter, which was essentially a sort of a constitution that laid out how the colonial government worked. The charter created a contractual relationship between the colony and the crown. So colonists considered that they were connected to the British Empire by an agreement between the ruling monarch and themselves. The colonial charters defined the shape of colonial government. The chief executive of a royal colony was the king or queen. Since the monarch happened to also be the ruler of Great Britain as well as each colony and resided in London, a little over 3,000 miles away, the king was represented by an agent called a royal governor in each of the royal colonies. The governor was appointed by the king, or in a couple of cases, Connecticut and Rhode Island, elected by the people of the colony, but still represented the king, no matter how he was created. The governor appointed officials and judges in most colonies, and he had a veto over colonial legislation. On paper, the governor's position was very powerful, but in fact, as we're going to see, the governor was often reduced to being not much more than a puppet of the legislature. Under the governor, each colony had a royal council. Now, how the council was chosen differed somewhat in different colonies. In some colonies, the governor appointed the council. In some colonies, Virginia, for instance, the king appointed the council. And in some colonies, again, Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, the royal council was elected by the assembly, by the legislature. But in each case, no matter what, each royal colony had a royal council. The council was made up of men who had influence and power and prestige, men who represented a sort of a local aristocracy within the colony. The council advised the governor and the assembly and had the power to vote down legislation from the assembly. The largest and most important institution in colonial government was the colonial assembly. The assembly had different names in different colonies. In Massachusetts, it was called the General Court of Massachusetts. In Virginia, it was called the House of Burgesses. But each colony had an assembly that represented the freeholders, that is, the eligible voters of the colony. The assembly's job was to pass legislation, to raise taxes, to pass laws. And those taxes and laws would then come under scrutiny from the royal council and the royal governor and the king himself. And all three of those institutions of government, the council, the governor, and the king, had a right to veto legislative bills from the assembly. Now, it didn't happen very often, but all three of those parties had the right, or those institutions had the right, to veto legislation from the assembly. So if you squinted just right, each colony's government looked a bit like the government of Britain. A monarch at the top, a governor who might be seen as the prime minister, a royal council made up of the best and brightest, which might be seen as a House of Lords, and a representative assembly that might be looked upon as a House of Commons. Now, colonists also believed that all of these institutions of government also serve the same purpose. That is, they were supposed to preserve the rights and liberties and Protestant religion of the colonists. Now, since the middle of the 1600s, a question that British people, British political thinkers asked on both sides of the Atlantic, both in England and in North America, was, what is the purpose of government? Why do people have government? Now, this was a pretty easy question to ask if you lived in absolutist France, so nobody asked the question much. If you lived in absolutist France, the idea was government existed to serve the king, and the king was appointed by God to control the people who really couldn't be trusted to control themselves. But England had a different view of this process of government, and so for them the question, what is the purpose of government, was very important. Now remember that England, by the 18th century, was surrounded by absolute monarchies. In France and Spain especially, the government consisted of the ruler and his servants who existed to make sure that that didn't change. There was no legislative assembly in France or Spain. The people had no direct input in the legislative process. The people existed to serve the ruler's purposes, to provide the king with wealth and soldiers and servants. To the British political observer, people who lived under an absolute monarch were basically slaves to that monarch. By that, they meant that the people had no part in their own government, had no control over their own persons, wealth, or property, because the absolute ruler could take what he wanted from his subjects at his convenience. Britain was different. The British believed that they had rebelled against absolute monarchy in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and replaced James, who they regarded as a Roman Catholic tyrant, with the Protestant Dutch Prince William and his wife Mary, the Protestant daughter of James II. According to British understanding of what the Glorious Revolution meant, when William and Mary became joint rulers of Britain, they agreed to rule the nation in a sort of alliance with Parliament. Essentially, they created a constitutional monarchy. For Englishmen on both sides of the Atlantic, the Glorious Revolution created representative government by the consent of the governed. Britons believed that the purpose of their government was to protect the lives, liberty, property, and Protestant religion of the people of England. Englishmen considered the House of Commons to be the fundamental protector of their rights and liberties, but this role was duplicated and shared throughout all the branches of government: the king, his cabinet, the House of Lords, the House of Commons. Colonials agreed, American colonists agreed, but in the context of their own governments. Colonists reasoned that their assemblies, as popularly elected bodies, were best qualified to legislate the interests of the colony. But they believed that the king helped to secure the people's rights and protect them from tyranny and from the insidious forces of Roman Catholicism. As an English judge put the idea, he said, quote, "The prerogative of the prince and the people's liberty are a support and security to each other. The king's interest and that of his posterity are inseparable from the rights and liberties of the people," end quote. In short, just like their English cousins, colonists believed that the purpose of government was the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people who were governed. Sound familiar? Now, in high school, Coach Boudreaux, who was your high school history teacher, might have talked about relations between British rulers and the American colonists. The kings and queens, he might say, were all tyrants, and the colonists spent about 200 years trying to get rid of them, and finally did so after the American Revolution. Well, that really isn't true. In fact, it's an explanation that has grown up since the Revolution. Actually, from the 1690s down to the 1770s, Americans really liked their kings. I know quite a bit of this because I actually wrote a book about it. I've already mentioned that when William and Mary came to the throne, Englishmen on both sides of the Atlantic believed that they had ushered in a new kind of English monarchy, where the ruler worked together with Parliament for the good of the people. In 1714, after the death of Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, Uh, she left no heirs, so it became necessary to bring a new line of kings into England. And the kings who were chosen was a new German royal family called the Hanovers. They were the electors of Hanover in Germany, and they came to rule Britain. Now, the party in power under the Hanovers were called the Whigs, Whigs. And they created a sort of a mythology around the Hanover kings in order to stay in power. They argued that the Hanovers were particularly protective of English Protestantism. The Hanovers simultaneously became the protectors of English liberty. Protestantism and liberty went together hand in hand in the minds of Englishmen in the same way that they linked Catholicism and slavery. Hanover rulers thus acquired a reputation as protectors and defenders of the civil liberties of their subjects. George I and George II were most often characterized, both in English and colonial sermons and newspapers, as benevolent fathers of their country. These rulers were very, very popular in the American colonies. Colonial ministers frequently described them as nursing fathers, that is, a ruler who loved and cared for his subject with the tenderness and affection of a good parent. A Congregationalist minister in New England, remember, Congregationalists, the last time we talked about them, didn't like kings much. A Congregationalist minister described George II this way in 1730. He said, "Such rulers are political rulers of the people. Our king is a nursing father, and our queen a nursing mother, who have expressed their tender care of and concern for us, her poor but dutiful people, in these distant parts of their dominions." Colonial newspapers, pamphlets, and sermons conveyed an interest in the private lives of the monarch and royal family that was often even very personal. Royals were the superstars of the age. Newspapers frequently carried stories about the day-to-day activities of the royal family, parties and events that they attended, the clothes that they wore, their appearance. Royal family weddings were celebrated, and royal deaths were mourned in print and from the pulpit. American preoccupation with the monarch and royal family even permeated the landscape of North America, as colonists named towns and countries, streets, and even physical features on the map after kings and princes, queens and royal consorts, from Lake George in Vermont to Fort King George in Georgia. So the kings and queens of Britain from the 1690s to the 1760s held a special place in both the political structures, the constitutions of the colonies, and in the hearts and minds of the colonists themselves. But there were problems with this relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. And in the 1750s and 60s, these problems would begin to grow out of proportion and would ultimately help to cause a rift between His Majesty and His Majesty's colonies in North America. There were two problems with the colonists' interpretation of their constitution and their place in the British Empire. We need to spend a little time on both of them. The first problem was royal governors. If the king was the chief executive, and everyone sort of admitted that he was, of the colony, then what was the function, what was the authority of the royal governor? He wasn't the king. He wasn't an elected official in most cases. He was supposed to look after the king's interests, but when the king's wishes were at odds with the assemblies, royal governors often found themselves accused of corruption and disloyalty to the king. After all, the king's interests should be identical to the interests of the people. And the king can do no wrong, remember. So there should not be any conflict of interest between the king and the people of the colony as represented by their assembly. Governors who tried to fulfill the king's instructions were often dumbfounded when the assembly refused to cooperate. To make matters more confusing, colonial assemblies often claimed the king as an ally when they refused to pass legislative measures that the king himself had told the governor to get. So the king instructs the governor to get the colonial assembly to pass a law that the king wants. The governor requests in the king's name that the assembly pass this law. The assembly balks. The assembly refuses to comply. The governor says, "What's up? The king wants this passed." The assembly says, "We know the king would never ask for a law like this, as it violates the rights of the people, so we won't pass it." If the governor pushes the point, the assembly accused the governor of acting like a tyrant toward the colony, of disloyalty to the king, of being corrupt and wicked and greedy. So even though royal governors were supposed to represent the king and his interests in the colony, since the governor was not the king, he couldn't always do his job. Now, all this stuff isn't taking place in a vacuum or even just in the American colonies. The politics of the empire take place in London as well. Every colony had one or more paid agents who represented that colony in London. Every colony had very influential citizens who communicated with their friends in Britain. So if the governor makes enough enemies in the colony, or he doesn't play ball with the colonial assembly, colonists can and often do exert pressure to get the governor recalled. Now, the governors also depend on the colonial assemblies to receive some sort of payment for their duties. Some assemblies got in the habit of essentially starving the governor if he refused to cooperate with the assembly. This was the case with unpopular executives, like New Jersey's first royal governor, Lewis Morris. The New Jersey legislature refused to pass any legislation to support the governor with a salary until the council and Morris assented to all of their bills. And they did this every year. Sometimes colonial legislatures even deprived popular governors of support. This was almost the rule in North Carolina. In 1740, a very popular and respected royal governor, a fellow by the name of Gabriel Johnson, complained that he had not received a single penny of salary from the colony in over 8 years. By withholding the governor's salary, the provincial legislature might force the king's most important colonial representative, the king's eyes and ears and hands in the colony, the royal governor, to become literally powerless. The second problem in colonial government has to do with the colonists' understanding of their constitution. Now, I've already mentioned that colonists believed that their government consisted of the king and the colonial council and the assembly working together to protect the rights, liberty, and religion of the colonists. Problem is, though, that British government believed that the British Parliament had a part in colonial government and that all Englishmen everywhere were represented by Parliament, even if they didn't elect a representative themselves. Now, this concept was called virtual representation. It meant that the House of Commons represented every Englishman everywhere. Now, this was a very important concept in British politics because only about 1 out of every 8 adult male English residents who were qualified by virtue of their wealth and property could actually vote for a member of the House of Commons. There were a bunch of reasons for this that aren't really important to you right now. The important thing here is that the House of Commons of Great Britain represented far less than 1/8 of the population of Britain. Cities were especially underrepresented, especially those that had grown in population as the result of the Industrial Revolution. For instance, 2 of the largest cities in England, Manchester and Birmingham, did not elect representatives to the House of Commons at all. But the House of Commons raised taxes, created laws that applied to all English subjects everywhere in Britain. Now, an important idea in British political thought was, I'm sure you've heard this one before, I hope you have anyway, no taxation without representation. It would become the bumper sticker, I guess I should say carriage sticker, of the American Revolution. What do you do, though, about the fact that only 1 in 8 qualified citizens are actually represented in the British House of Commons? And that's why Britain came up with virtual representation, to rationalize the fact that very few Englishmen were actually represented. No matter who elected members of the House of Commons, the members represented everybody. So stop complaining, shut up, sit down, and pay your taxes. If Parliament represented even those people in England who didn't elect members, it wasn't a very big stretch to argue that Parliament also represented Englishmen who resided in the colonies. Soame Jenyns, a member of Parliament, put it like this: Manchester, Birmingham, and many of our richest and most flourishing trade towns send no members to Parliament, and consequently cannot consent by their representatives because they choose none to represent them. If the towns of Manchester and Birmingham send no representatives to Parliament, are represented, why are not the cities of Albany and Boston equally represented in that assembly? Are they not like British subjects? Are they not Englishmen? Well, colonies didn't buy virtual representation, and they couldn't see any way that Parliament could possibly represent their interests. Colonists had long asserted, without serious contention from Britain, that the American colonies were essentially perfect states, not otherwise dependent on Great Britain than by having the same king, having complete legislatures within themselves. According to the prevailing theory among most colonists, the first settlers, at great personal risk, had come to the American wilderness and set up their own governments modeled on the English Constitution and within the king's allegiance. Americans viewed each colony as a realm of the King of Great Britain, distinct and independent from the government of Great Britain and connected to the mother country only by their charters and a shared king. Each colony had its own assembly to pass laws and raise taxes, which made the House of Commons in England completely superfluous and unnecessary for the colonists. Parliament might pass taxes and other laws that govern the working of the empire as a whole, so it was okay for Parliament to pass customs duties that were meant to control trade for the good of the whole empire. But Parliament had no right to tax any colony for the purpose of creating revenues, because it did not represent the subjects there, nor even hold any authority over the internal politics of the colony. That the Parliament of Great Britain, colonists said, should presume to tax His Majesty's provinces in North America violated the colonists' understanding of their fundamental relationship with the mother country. This fundamental difference of understanding between Britain and the colonies didn't really come up in any serious way until almost 1763. But when it did, as we're going to soon see, it really did some damage.